In this SUPboarder video, we're going to be doing a bit of a head-to-head stroke comparison video of the full-on performance boards from the RRD range. We have an iWAVE in a 7.7 in their Pro model construction, and now we have a COTAN 6.11 also in their Pro model construction. For us, this was the first time we've used the smaller RRD performance boards. We've used the bigger COTAN that came out really well in a review, and we've also reviewed the long SUP, which came out really well too. Obviously the construction of these boards is exactly the same. Their Pro models are an EPS foam core, and then the stuff you can see around the outside is the sort of carbon fishnet material wrapped right around the whole of the board, and around the stringer and around the rails you have extra carbon to give it more reinforcing. Definitely a real standout graphic, complete trademark for RRD. No other brand is really having the black and white styling as you see with these boards. So we picked these two boards because in size wise they are the closest to each other. So the specifications for the iWAVE, it's a 7.7 by 27 wide, 3 3/4 inches thick, 89 litres in volume. It comes as standard as a quad setup, but you can also run it as a thruster. And the weight of this board, we weighed this board 5 kilos. It is very, very light. So the specifications for the COTAN, it's 6.11, so it is shorter in that aspect, but then all stubby nose boards are. It's 27 inches wide, it's 4 inches thick, a little bit more thickness there, and it comes in at 98 litres in volume, and that one weighs 6 kilograms, so still a very lightweight board. Both the boards retail at around the €2,000 price point, but then they are really aimed at sort of the more top-end riders wanting a top-end lightweight construction. Both the boards come with 5 Futures fin boxes, so you can run them as quads or thrusters, but they come as standard in a quad setup, 4 fins. So looking at the outline shape of the board, you can see there's quite a big difference. The iWAVE has the more traditional performance-based shape, way more pulled in at the nose and more pulled in at the tail. The COTAN is the newer, new age board, the stubby nose boards, much fatter up at the nose with a square cut off nose, and still really quite wide at the tail, finished off with a diamond tail. It's interesting how the COTAN actually looks wider than the iWAVE because it is shorter, but it's exactly the same width. So looking at the underneath shape of the board, the nose rocker is a bit more exaggerated on the iWAVE because it's a little bit longer. The COTAN still has the nose rocker there, but it's squashed into a shorter length. Back at the tail kick, which is where the board raises up at the back of the tail, they're about the same amount of tail kick. The rail shapes on the board, because the iWAVE is a bit thinner in general, the rails are a little bit more thinned out, and they are much sharper, squarer edge towards the tail of the board. The COTAN's rail shape is a little bit thicker in general because the board is a bit thicker and the rails aren't as sharp as on the iWAVE. The bottom shape of the boards is the sort of thing you'd expect to see, and we've seen on other boards with the stubby nose having the single big concave and the more performance pulled in shape having the double concave. So we're going to have a talk about the fin setup in a minute, but let's move on to what it was like and actually using the board on the water. So standing on a board, obviously there is going to be quite a bit of difference, and it's not really because of the volume. The volume of the board is 10 litres greater on the COTAN, but to be honest, it doesn't really feel that much floatier. It does feel that the board is way shorter, and the water basically starts to wrap around the nose of the board and the tail of the board, so you've got to be a little bit more on it with your balancing forward and back. The iWAVE is smaller in volume, but actually it almost feels like you're standing on the same volume of board because of the longer length of the nose and tail. There's less water that comes over the nose and tail because it's a little bit longer in its overall length. So actually standing on them, they do actually feel pretty similar, even though the COTAN has got 10 litres more volume. Now paddling out and going over waves, now obviously you've got to approach it in your surf stance. You've got to get the nose up of both boards. The iWAVE was definitely way easier at punching over the waves, and that's because the rocker line at the nose is a little bit more drawn out and it pops itself over the waves way easier. The COTAN, because it's shorter, generally you're not paddling so fast for a start, and then you've got to get your body weight back. You have to get that nose up, otherwise the wave will wash over the top of the board. You can make paddling out when a wave does that on the COTAN quite easily, but it does tend to swamp the board, and then you've got to get yourself back up and get moving again. The real difference you'll notice when you're paddling out is the speed of the boards. The iWAVE has got way more speed and glide compared to the COTAN. The COTAN is a bit more of a slower, chuggier board. You've got to be more on it with your paddle strokes, and it constantly wants to turn basically around because of its much shorter in length, has less tracking than the iWAVE. So generally when it comes to catching the waves, it sort of feels the same as when you're trying to paddle out at a bit of speed. The Cotan is a little bit harder to track and keep in a straight line, but as soon as you get it moving a little bit, the concave starts to pull the water back towards the fins and you have a lot more stability, and then you can paddle in onto the wave quite hard. You can still catch relatively early waves if you get up there and you put your paddle strokes in. The iWAVE is a little bit easier to start the paddle onto the wave, and it tracks a little bit easier because it's overall length. The problem with the Cotan or any stubby nose board is if you're trying to catch the wave and you're not perfectly straight paddling towards the beach and you get a small bit of chop over the nose of the board, it's pretty much game over. It happens very quickly from that position to nose diving to falling off the board. So the iWAVE in that sense is a little bit easier. But that sort of thing is something you just have to be aware of when you start paddling these boards. Within the first 5 or 6 waves, you'll notice what you have to do to react on the boards. But definitely with the boards like the Cotans, the super small stubby nose boards, the 7 foot and belows, it starts to get a little bit trickier because there's less nose rocker, because they're a shorter board in general. You've got to be a little bit more on it with your footwork than you would do of the bigger size boards like the 711. On a wave, now this is where we found it really quite interesting, because it's been really nice to have 2 boards that are virtually exactly the same size and dimensions but completely totally opposite boards. The Cotan, it gives you a lot of response and a lot of speed. You can force the bottom turn, but it really feels like it has one sort of set angle of turn. You like to push yourself into the turn and it wants to redirect right back up to the face, which is great. But if you wanted to draw your turn out a bit longer, if you wanted to stretch your turn and shoot down the wave a little bit further, the board will feel like it has a little bit of a, I want to go back up there, I want to go back up there, and you're trying to regain and force it back down the line a little bit more. And that really is due to the back of the board, because it's relatively straight and the quad fins, it has a sweet spot which it just whips right up and it wants to turn. The iWAVE is opposite to that. The iWAVE has a turn where you can put the bottom turn in and you can carve hard, you can get your body weight right on the back of the back tail pad here and carve the board right up to the face, or you can slow the turn down and you can project the turn further down the wave. So it's a much more reactive board. So then because of that, when the waves were smaller, the Cotan was a lot of fun, especially when it's choppier. The board reacts way quicker in the smaller waves and it's much happier doing little hacks and little squirts off the top, and also coming off of re-entries. Way easier to do re-entries because of the wider nose, which just forces the board back down across the wave. The iWAVE is a little bit more slashy off the top turn. You can gouge a bit harder, and again you can change the angle of your top turn. You can redirect at a different speed. Doing off the tops and re-entries back into the wave, it does react very well and it's relatively easy to do, but you have got to be a bit more on it with your timing. The Cotan, you can pretty much slap the board up on the wave and it will come back round. The iWAVE, you've got to be a little bit more gentle and really be on it with that timing of the section. Talking about using the iWAVE in a quad setup, for the first probably month we used the iWAVE in a quad setup. It's much quicker like that, but it's way more locked in. It didn't really want to redirect very quickly back up to the face, and the top turns were okay, but they're a little bit more drawn out, which is what you'd expect of a quad setup of a board. But when the waves get bigger, unfortunately we haven't got any great clips of the waves bigger, because every time the swell picks up, suddenly all of the filmers just want to go surfing, and can't understand why. But with a quad setup, the iWAVE works way better at really holding you to that face, giving you more grip on those bottom turns. Because when it's a little bit bigger with a thruster setup, a real traditional thruster setup, 3 fins the same size, it's quite skitty and it's quite quick, but it's a little bit twitchy underfoot. So the quad setup really sets that board and gives you a much more stable feel on the wave when they're bigger. So just to give you one more idea of what I mean by the turning differences between these two boards, a cutback for instance, a cutback on a more traditional base board like the iWAVE, you can pretty much start the turn and you can redirect at whatever speed you want. You can speed up the maneuver halfway through the turn and come back into the wave. The Cotan has a sort of setting. It wants to cut back, and if you want to slow the turn down, it almost asks you to straighten up and then come back round again. So it hasn't got that smooth re-entry to the turn. So the iWAVE in general is a much more smoother flowing board that doesn't mind adjusting its turns and reacting to the rider. The Cotan is an amazingly quick board that works really well in choppy water, but it really has its setting dialed in, certain snaps, certain bottom turns, certain cutbacks, and that's how it really works well. So when it comes down to the best conditions these two boards work in, the iWAVE works well when it gets big, it works when it's small as well, but it's got to really be clean. It struggles a little bit when it's choppy, and that's really because it's hard to generate speed. The COTAN works really well when it's small, choppy, clean, up to mid-size. It struggles a little bit when it gets big because of the speed is a bit too much for the board, and you can't really slow it down that much. So who's going to best suit these boards? Well, obviously these two boards are relatively small boards, so body weight rise, it's probably 75 kilos, maybe a little bit more and down. But if you were after these sort of boards, there are bigger sizes to look at as well. Ability wise, if you're thinking about moving down onto boards like this and you're about the right weight, you've got to be pretty happy at riding your bigger board. When I mean your bigger board, it's probably an 8.5, about 115 litres. You've got to be able to catch pretty much any wave, front side paddling in, back side paddling in, happy with good bottom turns, coming off the top turns, re-entries. Really sort of exhausted that sort of surfing and feel like you want to move down and give yourself a new challenge. They are not impossible to use, you've just got to keep moving, keep paddling, and really learn to paddle them on flat water first. That's another really good move you could do. As for which board is the easiest to use, well, probably the COTAN will take that, and that's because it's generally shorter obviously, and it requires less footwork and trimming than the iWAVE does. The COTAN is very plug and play, you can just catch a wave and turn up and down the wave, generate speed and do little turns. The iWAVE does take a little bit more tuning and trimming. The iWAVE can do absolutely everything the COTAN can do when it's clean, but as soon as it gets a bit choppy or not so powerful, the COTAN is completely all over it. Hope you found that comparison video interesting and informative, and you've learnt something about the more stubby nose based boards and the more traditional pro shapes. Remember, check out SUPboarder Mag for more reviews and technique, and also SUPboarder Pro for even more in depth in the reviews and technique videos. But until next time, we'll see you on SUPboarder Mag or on YouTube. Thanks a lot.